Our modern myths. What do I mean by the word myth? I've been using it a lot in these videos, and maybe it's time I took a closer look at the term. Let's look at some dictionary definitions from the Merriam-Webster. First definition is this: a usually traditional story of ostensibly historical events that serves to unfold part of the worldview of a people or explain a practice, belief, or natural phenomenon. That's a definition that I certainly have in mind when I'm using the word. It's first and foremost a story. I would suggest that those who initially tell this story understand it to be factual in some sense. Many of these stories are origin stories or etiologies, providing an account for how things came to be the way they are. Stories of the origin of the world, of course, are such, as are more local stories explaining maybe why this river is here, or this mountain, or this giant boulder. The people who tell these stories probably believe they're giving genuine accounts. Only later, I think, when other explanations for these phenomena become apparent, do we recognize these stories as myths. Now, of course, it's very difficult to know the extent to which the people telling these stories around the campfire think they're talking about real events. There's at least a suspicion that the events they're describing took place in a world or at a time that is different from the present. They take place in dream time, for example, or in some very, very remote past. But I think initially these stories are intended to be stories of actual events. We get into difficulties about what real means and what real meant to these people. These stories are real, but also somehow different. These stories are intrinsically different from the story Jack tells when he returns from the hunt. There's something otherworldly, numinous, even authoritative about mythological stories that sets them apart. I'm sure the people who first told them, when they were still regarded as true, nevertheless still recognise this difference, recognise that these stories were special in some way. Otherwise, why keep on telling them? These stories are also usually in some way proscriptive. They don't only describe the origin of things or describe events from a distant past, they also indicate something of how we're expected to behave in the present. Perhaps they are, in fact, attempts to justify and validate societal behaviours that actually arose for completely different reasons. Telling the story not only explains where this behaviour comes from, but also serves to reinforce this behaviour. The second dictionary definition is this: a popular belief or tradition that has grown up around something or someone. I think a modern example of such a myth is the American dream. Also, I would suggest the idea of the President of the USA as the leader of the free world. Here in Australia, there are myths around everyone spending all their time at the beach, that it's always summer in Australia, like in Summer Bay, the setting for Home and Away, that Australian soap opera, if you don't know what that is. Or myths about particular people in particular places being friendly. The idea that the sun never shines in England or that the English summer lasts for 2 days, these are also myths. They're all easily debunked, of course, but we persist in believing them, or at least repeating them. The more serious of these probably become sacrosanct. I think, for example, of the myths surrounding Anzac Day here in Australia. That's a day that we commemorate the Gallipoli landing in 1915 during the First World War. Mythologies develop around important historical figures or events which are difficult to shift and may even create anger among some people when they're challenged by others. I have no doubt at all that we have myths of this kind in society today, some of which are acknowledged as such when they're challenged and some not so much. I'll leave it there as far as dictionary definitions of myth go. There are others, such as using the word to indicate that something is untrue or not actually factual. These things are not so pertinent here. I can acknowledge that we hold myths in the second sense, but what about this first sense, the sense of a story, or somehow a timeless story, or a story outside time and place as we normally understand it? Do we have such myths today? Of course, there are some people who still adhere to earlier mythologies, such as the story of the Garden of Eden or of the flood in the Old Testament. But most of us would recognize that these are myths. Are there myths that we hold today that we don't recognize as such? If there are, then I think they would also look a little different from the other stories we tell each other in novels, in movies, or around the water fountain. They're likely to be special in some way. However, we're still likely to regard them as true, even take it for granted that they're true. I suppose, in a way, the idea that we are solid objects and that these things around us are solid objects, when in fact we're actually mostly empty space, and from another point of view, we're complex wave functions. So I think this idea that we're solid objects is, in a way, a myth. Some would argue that the notion of free will is a myth. But I'm thinking here more about areas of modern science where our normal language breaks down, at the edges of things. For example, the story of the Big Bang has a kind of mythological feel to it, because it's talking about something that happens in a kind of non-time and non-space, both of which only come into being when the universe comes into being. This is a kind of dream time, I suppose, and we can only talk about these events indirectly and by means of metaphor and analogy, or mathematics. The same is true at the subatomic level, at or beyond the realm of perception. We talk about particles and waves and fields, but none of these terms is being used in the same sense that they're being used in the macro world. Some of the language is overtly metaphorical, as when we talk of the attributes of quarks, such as spin, taste, colour, and so on. We believe that these events, the Big Bang and quantum events, are referring to something real, but we're also aware of the fact that this reality is in a realm that's different from the realm that's accessible to our senses. This sounds a bit like the shaman talking of giants and serpents around the campfire. He believes, as do the listeners, that he's talking about real events, but also that this reality is different in some fundamental way from the reality that we see around us. We don't see dragons and giants and serpents. But this other reality, this mythological reality, does leave its mark here. That river, for example, that boulder. And in the same way, the Big Bang and quantum events leave their mark on the world around us. So, will we at some stage move beyond our current mythological understanding, whether this lies in science, as I've been describing, or elsewhere? Will we move beyond this into a more realistic understanding? Well, I guess only our descendants will be able to answer that.